So we're here in the 12-mile swamp conservation area, and we're going to figure out why this area would leave a small group of American Marines and militiamen from Georgia fighting for their lives. Now, before we get into the ambush itself, we're going to backtrack a few months and figure out why the United States was even here with military personnel. Now, some of you may know that in 1812, Florida was a Spanish territory. So why would there be United States Marines and militiamen engaged in combat in Florida? Well, tensions were pretty high between the British and the Americans in 1812, as many of you may know. Well, they saw Florida as a potential launching point for a British invasion into the southern states. Now, during the American Revolution, this is essentially what happened. The British would launch an invasion of these southern colonies, and many of those soldiers would be from Florida. When Savannah would fall and Fort Morris, just south of Savannah, would fall, many of the soldiers were garrisoned in British East Florida in St. Augustine. So, in March of 1812, the United States would launch an incursion into Spanish-controlled Florida to essentially annex it by force. Now, once the United States crossed into Florida, they took several small groups of Spanish soldiers captive. They took Amelia Island, and they made it all the way to what is present-day Fort Mose. Fort Mose was known for being the first free black settlement in what would become the United States. Well, the United States forces would set up camp in and around Fort Mose. Now, when you're besieging a city, one of the main goals is to not allow supplies and soldiers in or out, and you're going to essentially, hopefully, win a war of attrition. Well, unfortunately for the Americans, when they began their siege of St. Augustine, one, they didn't really have a whole lot of people to lay siege to St. Augustine, and two, they were running low on supplies themselves. Now, like we just touched on, the Americans were running low on supplies themselves, and unfortunately for them, the U.S. government withdrew support of this action because it became widely unpopular in the United States. Now, in order to get those supplies, they would have to go to a blockhouse several miles from here, and it would be in the northwest direction along the St. Johns River. Now, unfortunately for the Americans, they would have to pass through our location here, which is 12-mile swamp. And as you can see, obviously we have a pretty decent established road here, but in the 1800s, many of these roads weren't here, and if they were, they weren't well maintained. Now, those of you not native to Florida, this is a palmetto thicket, and they are pretty prevalent in this area. You can see another one there, a couple more back this way. But this is just some of the terrain that the small detachment of U.S. Marines and Georgia militiamen would have had to encounter. Now, I spent some time in the military, but by no means does that make me an expert military tactician. But if I had to set up an ambush, it would be in this location. Again, when the Americans would set out with a small detachment of Marines, they would have to go several miles, and they would have to cross through 12-mile swamp. As you can see behind me, the terrain here is just full of brush and palmetto thickets, which aren't really forgiving. And this area provides plenty of cover for an ambushing force. Now, the Spanish also knew that the United States forces would have to cross through 12-mile swamp. And on that same night, Spanish militia, under the command of Lieutenant Prince Whitten and his party of 25 black militia, which were predominantly comprised of escaped African Americans who escaped slavery in the southern states, they made up a large portion of his force. And he also had some Seminole auxiliaries and some Spanish militia, like we just touched on. Now, you can imagine walking through here in the middle of the night. It would be terrifying. There's really no light source out here outside of the moon, especially during that time. So you can imagine, as an American Marine or Georgia militiaman, walking through trails, because you had covered wagons, so you couldn't just go through this terrain unless you planned on making a trail all the way to what was the Davis Blockhouse, which is several miles northwest on the St. Johns River, and that's where the American supplies were. But you can just imagine how on edge the Marines and militiamen would have been. And finally, when they got into what is called the kill zone, the Spanish militia opened up a point-blank volley, which means that all the soldiers would have fired at one time, creating essentially a giant shotgun. Now, they would also use this tactic because the flintlock smoothbore muskets at the time had a 25% misfire rate. So if they all fired at once, you'd guarantee that at least some of the muskets would fire. Now, the Spanish militia targeted the rear of the column, which means they would target the back of the column. So as we're walking this way, fire would erupt on your flank, And again, point blank means that they're pretty close. This is about 10 feet from the trail to the wood line here. And after that initial volley, a U.S. Marine sergeant would lie dead. The commander, Captain John Williams, was hit. He would fall, and he would actually be wounded 7 more times here. Can you believe that? 7 wounds he would receive in this brief but intense ambush. And unfortunately, he would succumb to his injuries on September 29th. And also, horses on the rear wagon would be hit and killed, rendering that wagon useless, and several other Marines and militiamen would lie wounded just after the initial volley. Now, the fighting here would last several hours. The United States put up a pretty decent fight after the initial contact, and the Spanish would pull back. They would actually take one of the wagons and load their wounded onto the wagon and retreat back to St. Augustine. And unfortunately for the United States, some of their forces would continue to the Davis Creek blockhouse, and several of the wounded soldiers would be left behind, and a lot of them would find cover in this thick brush and hopefully await rescue the next morning. Now, we mentioned that the commander, Captain John Williams, would be wounded up to 8 times here, and he would take refuge in these palmetto thickets because he was too wounded to move and continue to the blockhouse. But the next morning, a rescue force would find him, and they found that his left arm, right leg were broken, his right arm and left leg and abdomen had been pierced by several musket balls. Jeez, could you imagine? 8 wounds. I get out of bed and I roll my ankle and I'm done for the day. This guy gets shot multiple times, breaks a leg, breaks an arm, and he manages to survive for at least 2 more weeks. And I just want to give you an example of how thick some of this brush truly is. I braved the possible spiders and snakes, and I walked about 10 feet into the woods, and over in this direction, like I said, about 10 to 15 feet is the actual trail, and you can't see it. I can't really see the trail. You can't really see me. So again, this goes to show you how unforgiving the terrain here is. And if you're setting up an ambush, you have unlimited cover. And you can see it's just wide open here. And you can imagine, as a Marine walking, at the time they had blue uniforms with white pants, I believe. So even at nighttime, you would stick out like a sore thumb here. And again, those point blank volleys coming from the wood line here would just tear your ranks to shreds. So obviously, the Americans weren't able to resupply because of this ambush. They've taken casualties. 2 Marines killed in action. I believe 6 or 7 have been wounded in action. And honestly, I'm not sure how many militiamen would receive wounds and be killed in action. I couldn't really find any records of the Georgia militiamen. But the events here would essentially bring the American incursion into Spanish-controlled Florida to an end. The forces would pull back out of St. Augustine, and they would pull back to the state of Georgia. So this was a pretty cool find. Luckily for social media, I was able to discover this story and then do my own research and learn a little bit about it, because as you can see, there's no plaques, there's no historical markers, there's really nothing acknowledging the events that took place somewhere in the 12-mile swamp. So I hope you enjoyed this one and learned a thing or two, because like always, I'm constantly learning new things, especially in my own community.